Welcome to office hours for service APIs. We are really getting down to the end of this, I think. And on that note, I think today will be the day we hit our RC out, our first RC, maybe our only RC for alpha, I don't know. And as part of that, we should go through our alpha release checklist. I think, I haven't updated this in a while. I know our milestone maybe is more up to date at this point. Yeah, let's take a look here real quick. We've got a few things still left here. As far as actual pull requests, I think we're pretty limited though. We have this PR for listener condition types, and I think, James, you have one more PR you'd like to get in around conditions, and this is for positive states. I forget exactly what's left on conditions.
I don't have a PR for that one yet.
Okay, but that's
so
the last thing that's.
Let me just find the issue.
I saw the issue and I'm not seeing it in here, so maybe we just need to.
Yeah, it's number 370.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, oh, it is already in here. I just missed it. Okay, great.
I don't think that's a blocker for running the release, because implementations can always add their own reason. It's just I think adding a reason for when the condition is a successful state, just standardizing that is useful and helpful, but we can ship alpha 1 without it.
Yeah, agreed. Cool. And a lot of these that are left are kind documentation. It looks like, James, you have fixed, or you have a PR to fix this one already. Oh yes, that's right, because it was fixed in a separate PR that you've since closed. Thank you.
Yeah, originally I fixed it by adding extensions to the gateway, and I think we discussed that last week.
Yeah.
So I'll just remove it here. I do have in the back of my mind a task, something to add a section to the docs about how we view extending the API, different ways to extend the API.
Yeah.
But that's by no means a release blocker.
Yeah, makes sense. Well, this looks really straightforward. I know I've seen this before. It's unused. It'd be great to have it fixed. Does anyone have any problem with me just getting this in now?
Go for it.
Cool. All right. So that's V1 Alpha 1, but let's talk about the thing that I brought up earlier. James and I had a discussion around this PR. It's listener condition types, and it seems to at least somewhat contradict what we had originally proposed as guiding principles for conflict resolution. But I think this may be the correct approach. I wanted to get this in front of more eyes and make sure that everyone was on board with what's happening here. Maybe, James, do you want to provide a bit more background on this?
Sure. So I think maybe a month ago, or even longer, we talked about we had talked about the conditions of vocabulary, and I felt like we had consensus around that. People seemed to feel that most of the error cases were covered. So this is my PR for applying that into the API. So when I came down to it, I noticed that there was a lot of there's some cases in HTTP routes specifically where the error handling is pretty vague for a spec. So, we have language like, if the referent cannot be found, the invalid routes status condition on any gateway will be true. Okay, so invalid routes sort of becomes this resolved ref, invalid routes condition in this new vocabulary maps to the resolved refs condition type. So the resolved refs has a reason. And so I guess then that sort of starts begging the question of, well, what do you actually do with it? Do you raise the condition and then do you kind of soldier on? Do you raise this condition and then like what? It's not very specific about what a controller should actually do. So basically, as a general blank, easy to describe, generally easy to describe, easy to implement, easy to understand policy. The language I added here is that if you can't, when you can't resolve stuff in a route, the controller should flag that in a resolved refs condition, and it should say I dropped the routes as the reason, and then the route should be dropped. So there's a summary in basically a list of pros and cons in the comment at the bottom, which I summarized from the Slack thread where Rob and I kind of went back and forth on this. From one point of view, dropping a whole route, we have this principle that that updates should break as little as possible. So I mean, with my language lawyer hat on, I think there's a fair bit of wiggle room in that within that principle, because we could define as little as possible with a fair degree of latitude. But I think dropping a whole route is, a larger error case than dropping part of a route. But on the other hand, the semantics of dropping a whole route are fairly straightforward to reason about, whereas the semantics of dropping part of the functionality of a route are kind of less so. So now we also have these cases where different references seem to be, you could argue that different references are important in different ways. So dropping a mirroring target, some sites may be okay with that. I mean, you can construct thought experiments where, oh, mirroring really matters for some business reason and it's super critical. But in general, I think it's reasonable to assume that mirroring is less important than, say, the reference for a match. And then we get into but then once we go down this path, we end up with, well, different references and different kinds of references within the HTTP route have different error cases. So that adds more semantics to the API, which I would argue makes it harder to use and harder to implement. So you're less likely to get consistent behavior across implementations, and the whole thing is generally going to be harder to learn. One issue which I think is probably one of the more interesting issues is, what do you actually do when it fails to resolve, but you still accept the route? So if you accept the route and mirroring is turned off, for example, how do we tell the operator that that's happened? So if we just silently said everything's okay, then everything would be okay, but the actual fundamental status in the infrastructure wouldn't match the spec. And that seems bad to me, because it's pretty misleading. The only way you know that it's not working is by having good operational visibility into what ought to happen. I feel like the API, when the API doesn't do what you asked it to do, it should surface that somehow. But we don't actually have a way to surface that we've done a bit of what you asked, or that we haven't done quite all of what you asked. So that's my initial torrent of words, and maybe someone else has some perspective.
Yeah, that's a really good background, and I feel like this is a necessarily complex issue to solve correctly. The one side of this is that you risk breaking things more than necessary. As an example, somebody has an extension ref somewhere that doesn't matter too much, but somebody somewhere else in your cluster deletes the resource that's pointing to. And then every route that is, pointing to that thing that doesn't matter that much for whatever reason breaks. That feels bad, but I can't think of a good way around that. Like what James has already said is the most consistent, the easiest thing to explain is if you have any reference in your route that does not resolve, we're going to drop that route. That feels a bit harsh, and I was making an argument above that maybe we can do more than that, but after talking through it more, I don't know.
So one point I have, so Rob, you made a good point where, an extension ref that does not matter too much. But imagine you have an extension ref which adds authentication to an endpoint, right? And if that is missing and you're exposing that route, it's a security problem now, right? So it's hard to know how much that referent matters or not.
Yeah,
that's
exactly
what I mean. In the list, I was saying that we can construct a thought experiment for each reference where it does matter. So I think that's an example of that. So you can always, I think any one of us on this call have seen enough different deployments where we could probably imagine some use case where some particular reference in, some particular reference is going to actually crucially matter in some way.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's taken me a while to come around to this. I'd initially argued, well, okay, maybe a mirror or two. Maybe that's one thing where if you miss mirror, everything else will work. But again, that seems, like I think James' idea there was, well, what if that mirror is for audit logging and you absolutely need that for compliance? Well, okay. And similarly for forward to, I'd argued, well, okay, let's say that you have multiple forward to targets and you only lose one of them. And maybe it's only your canary target is an invalid reference. Do you want to drop all of your traffic? But you don't know, like obviously we have no way of knowing which one has become invalid. So yeah,
So on the chat, Harry raised the idea of using events to address this. I don't have much experience with events, but maybe someone else has some perspective on that.
Events are not easy to use. The last time I used, but it's been a while. They're sort of half baked and like the machinery around it is not complete, but that's another way to raise, okay, if something is invalid and if status is not the right place to raise that, then events are sort of logs for that specific resource.
I think that's a really good idea, especially if we have a route that has been accepted transitioning to a route that is being dropped, which feels like a really negative experience. Surfacing an event is going to be relatively visible. As someone who debugs clusters on occasion, one of the things that is easy to look for when you get into a namespace is events for that namespace. What happened here? And so publishing an event in the same namespace as a route or gateway, whatever it happens to be, could help provide some visibility, some more visibility than simply a status condition on a route or a gateway. So I agree with that. I don't think we need that necessarily for V1 Alpha 1, but I think that's a good idea going forward.
Is events? I feel like adding events to the API is probably going to be
sorry, the audio
a fair
is
chunk of
pretty
work.
choppy.
Am I chopping
So,
or are you chopping, Bowie?
Boy, you are chopping.
everything is choppy. Can you hear me, or I can type it in chat?
Yeah, well, I can hear you. You're a bit choppy, but I can understand you.
Okay. So I'm reading this, dropping whole routes works against our principles or updates to break as little as possible. One thing that's interesting here is we don't mention the semi-statefulness, because breaking as few as possible involves going from the current state to the next state. It sounds like the proposal is to you go to the next state and then the things that don't work you drop out. Is that what I'm reading here?
I suppose that, okay, so I think at that level of detail is going to be implementation defined. So say you had a route and you got it working and then a route was updated. Should you remove the working route altogether, or should you keep the working route and drop the previous update? No, that's not totally clear to me. I think the latter is kind of what you want, because that's the one that leaves you in a consistent state. So if you kept the previous version of the route programmed into the infrastructure and then raised an error on the new version of the route, then it feels like you don't have a good way to, feels like your spec is then inconsistent with your infrastructure state in a sort of semi-permanent way.
Right, I see. Yeah, this came up in different contexts, is that if you submit an update to the system, what should you return while the update transaction is happening? Usually the answer is you should return the previous state until the transaction is completed. Whereas Kubernetes, it seems like we don't have that luxury.
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine implementations doing different things, I suppose, but it really depends on, does your implementation have enough state to be able to know that this has happened? Because you could say that you could argue, you could reason that, okay, the dropped routes, I resolved ref and I dropped the route, but what I mean by that is I dropped the update to the route, but I still kept the previous version of that route. And I think that, I don't see anything in our spec that would prevent that behavior as sort of a quality of implementation.
Yeah, this is hard because in some sense, that's pretty much the behavior we want, is we don't want to take something that was working into an unworking state. But if you have no sense of history, then you'll necessarily have to write rules that may end up doing that. Like you have to merge everything as is, as described, and it might have really strange consequences because you have to make decisions for the user in that case.
Yeah, I think there's also cases where what if you programmed the route and everything was fine and everything resolved, and then some of the things that I guess the route resolved to were deleted. Would you then withdraw the route? Arguably, so the route can be broken after the fact by some other changes in the cluster.
Yeah, and I think that's what we have to do here. The more I've thought about it, and to take the argument a step further here, the whole idea of, let's take the authentication example as a great example. Let's say someone deploys a route, it works, but they forgot authentication. And so there's panic and they deploy this new authentication thing, but their authentication module, filter, whatever it is broken and the reference doesn't work. But the route continues to work because we thought we'd be clever and keep the old version working until they got the, until a new version that was valid came through. And we've actually
that one
caused more damage.
That one seems less of an issue because they deployed something that was insecure, and let's say they like fell asleep and then realized like there was a time where everything worked but there was no authentication, and the fact that they were panicking and applying it later and then somehow that update didn't work doesn't like it didn't work. It doesn't work anyways. Like what can the system do with that update? So
Well, no.
In that case, if they were
Yeah, to clarify, I'm arguing for breaking things. I am arguing for the idea that you would not want to let things continue to work in that situation, and instead you should just try and be consistent with the desired state, even if the desired state is invalid. And then if the desired state is invalid, then just drop the route, but don't try to do anything clever beyond that.
Yeah, I think like there is definitely a huge swath of config where we just can't figure it out for the user. In that case, like I guess we could state some blast radius where like the whole route will be evicted. This is the worst you can expect because we just can't figure out a safe intent.
And in that scenario, do we just surface a degraded status condition? Or at least letting the user know that something's not right?
Yeah, like definitely we need to know, we need to tell the user for sure using a condition that there's something wrong. Like it can't be signal to the user like, oh, everything is okay, but we silently discarded something. It's an interesting space to explore, is like, could you have a partially working thing along resource boundaries eventually? Like, if you discard a whole route, could the user understand that and work with it and be okay with that as like a boundary for things working? It's a natural one because you can change things atomically inside of a route resource, but you can't do it across multiple route resources.
Yeah,
I feel like, sorry, Rob, go ahead.
No, go. I think what you're describing is just that we'd be treating the route as a failure boundary, which seems entirely reasonable to me. That it's one reason that you can have so many routes, that if you screw up one route, the rest of your routes will continue to work. I don't know if that's exactly where you're going, but.
Yeah, I think I'm reading.
I was going to say
I'm slowly going down these bullets, and it looks like bullet 3.
I was not able to understand your last comment as well, unfortunately.
I'm just saying that it looks like your bullet 3 from the bottom.
Yeah.
Like, one thing that you could say, and I don't know how confusing this would be, is that if the implementation allows for preserving the old state as long as possible, like you could say that they made an update to a route and then it didn't take effect. It starts spitting out conditions saying, this route is wrong. I kept the old stuff, but this is like indeterminate right now. You need to fix it. That might be like a little nicer for the user, but it's not required. Like what's required is that you have to signal the error. And what the user should expect is that unless their implementation is really sophisticated, that whole route might just be removed.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's lots of room to, potentially improve in specific implementations on this, and maybe we can update the spec to be to leave a little bit of room for that. But I think, you know, the goal for right now is just making sure that what this PR commits to is a reasonable starting point, at least reasonable enough for RC1. And I think the consensus that I'm hearing is that this probably is, that this is a good starting point. And if we need to adjust it, we're starting from kind of the most restrictive option, and we can eventually add more advanced capabilities on top of this if we need to.
Yeah, I
So I
agree.
think-
Like, but we should just put language in there that says like you could have a more nuanced handling of the error. Like you could try to preserve traffic as much as possible, but we don't make that guarantee. That's like up to the implementation.
I think Daniel's suggestion of there being some sort of degraded status is interesting to explore, and that could be something that we could put on the route itself in the route status conditions for some gateway.
To clarify, you're saying in the gateway conditions for the route.
Yes. So on the route, so the problem is that on the gateway we have, you know, the gateway has like lots of routes, and
Yeah.
so it's kind of syntactically awkward. There's not really a good syntax to say, hey, I'm on the gateway to say I had a problem with a specific route. There's no good way to do that at the moment. But on the route, we have the route status, which is status conditions keyed by the parent gateway. So we could put that on the route. We could put some sort of degraded condition on the route itself, and then you'd be able to list routes and say, oh, this route, you know, route A is degraded on gateway B, and there would be my reason there.
Yeah, that makes sense. So to pull this back to a potential RC, what do we feel like we need to change, if anything, between now and you know, including this potentially in a release candidate? My personal bias is that this, as it is a good improvement that could have further revisions, such as, like you're saying, a degraded state added after the fact, after an RC. But getting this into our first RC is probably, well, maybe only RC is probably a good idea. I don't know.
Maybe we just need implementation feedback. Maybe we just need implementation experience for this stuff in the end.
Yeah. Yeah. Is anyone hesitant about? I know there's a lot in here. I don't know if anyone else has gotten a chance to look at this PR quite yet. I think this does match the conditions we talked about before, and the vast majority of you know, discussion we had today is what I think is important. It's about what we do when something becomes invalid. Yeah. I'm not hearing a lot. I'm also not hearing a lot of anyone calling for pause on this, and I would be fine if someone wants to hold off on this and wait until we do X, Y, and Z. That's fine. But if, you know, in lieu of that, I would be tempted to push this forward sooner, just so we can get some form of RC out.
Yeah, I think, I mean, let's get this in again. Let's remind ourselves this is alpha. Although we want to
Yeah.
minimize changes, but let's take more risks right now rather than, you know, that allows for experimentation. So that would be my leaning.
Yeah. Yeah, this is an RC for a V1 Alpha 1 release. So it seems like the bar is reasonably high, but we lower than it will be in the future. Okay, cool. Anyone else want to say anything on this PR? All right, we'll keep on moving then. Thank you, James, for this. I'll follow up on this after our call today, but I think we're good to go with this one.
Cool. Thanks for the discussion, everybody.
Yeah, definitely. The next one is RC1. Just to get a feel for among working group, among all of us, does it feel reasonable to we get that PR in and tag an RC1 for this alpha, or is there anything else that feels significant that feels like we should try and squeeze in as well?
There is the namespace PR that is pretty.
Yeah, thank you.
I think that's by you, Rob. That we should.
I forgot that one hadn't made it in yet. Thank you. I think this is super close. This has an LGTM, and just looking for another sanity check, I guess.
Yeah, this is almost good. We just need another set of eyes and.
Yeah. Damien or James or Bowie or anyone, if you're able to take a look at this, I think we're probably all on the same page now.
Okay, I'll take a look right now.
Okay. Cool. Thanks.
This is related to the Google Doc that you posted as well, Rob?
No, that is a massive one. This good question. So this one is a relatively tiny iteration. Let's see. I think I've got an examples thing down here. Yeah, this is the change, right? So it uses this kind of enum approach that we were using.
Rob, I'm going to approve this, and then you can talk about that doc, which will affect us anyway.
Yeah. So this is a really tiny change. It's just trying to match the pattern that we've moved to elsewhere and get rid of a Boolean.
Seems totally reasonable.
Cool. But that's a great segue. Thank you. Let me get into this one. Sorry for anyone who looked at this PR initially. I realized like an hour after this issue, like an hour after I created this issue, that my second link that was supposed to link to the doc linked to the security model, which was not helpful. So it actually links to the doc now. Last week, I kind of tried to summarize all the options we talked about as a working group, and then I tried to get some feedback from other SIGs. I talked to Antoine's and API Machinery, Mike, Denise from Auth, and Saad from Storage. Storage being relevant because of storage class and similar restrictions that they've tried to implement. And of course, Tim, because he's had a lot of feedback and did not like the initial approach that I proposed here. So that's the background for this doc. I had a starting point here and then expanded further based on feedback I got, and I think there's some comments that have been added since I released this. I also sent this out for anyone who's on the SIG network mailing list. I sent it out on SIG network this afternoon as well, just to try and broaden the net and get as much feedback as we possibly can. It's the feedback I've gotten so far is generally, this is a common problem. We are not the only ones trying to solve this, but there is not an amazing solution out there right now. And so there's interest, like SOD and SIG storage, they need to implement something very similar for something they're working on. And so they're watching this closely as well. And yeah, anyway, that is the background here. This is a large doc. I don't know that we're going to get through all of it today. We'll see. But I outlined 5 different approaches here, some of which will seem very familiar to everyone here and some will be somewhat new. Yeah, so with that, I gave a little bit of background for people who may be less familiar with service APIs. But this is probably all fairly familiar to us. And then I went through 5 different approaches. And one is one we've already considered, which is the namespace selector or list option. Another one is kind of the follow-up that Micaiah had been initially suggested and been working through a POC of, which would be to find a way to use RBAC with this. Storage class and service type load balancer use resource quota. So wanted to include that. Tim had an idea for a entirely new resource and pattern that initially called gateway class grant, but could be called whatever. And then the final option of some kind of policy agent is basically to say, well, this is not something we're going to solve, at least not yet. And, you can solve this with a policy agent like OPA and Gatekeeper. So those are the various approaches I have outlined here. Feel free to question any of, I tried to give like a really high level summary of each of these categories. I don't know how meaningful this summary is, and I don't know how accurate my attempts at summarizing user complexity and prior art are, but definitely add comments, add thoughts, whatever. This is a starting point. With that said, I got a really good comment and feedback from Antoine here, and this just kind of covers the entire doc. And so I wanted to call this out. Antoine is against the idea of a namespace selector or list. And the idea is each component should do one thing and focus on its own specific business, and expanding gateway class to care about policy is making the API messier. Too many responsibilities in one component typically creates nasty couplings that are difficult to get rid of.
That's sort of consistent with your initial research that multiple other projects need something similar. So
yeah,
when you're in a situation where multiple projects need sort of one thing, and then one of them goes out and trailblazes, that one trailblazing project is going to get burned by its trailblazing, right? Because what's very likely to happen is everyone's going to look at that one project. Oh, what did they do? And now we can use their experience to do, quote, the right thing or something common. And then that one project has to figure out how to transition from its special case to the general case.
Yeah. That is a great summary of the problem we currently find ourselves with. So his suggestion is to find some other component wherever possible and delegate that responsibility there. He mentions OPA and the number, policy agent type approach. and a number of other potential options, like, gateway class grant, whatever it happens to be. So that's some great feedback from Antoine. Just on these different options as a whole. But with that, I'll get into the ones that we're most familiar with. Our current implementation is 1A, which is a namespace selector on gateway class. We're probably reasonably familiar with this. And we looked into how we could limit the enforcement of this to gateway creation. But again, I got some feedback from multiple people that when you're trying to do something like this and the feedback is not immediate, that results in a poor user experience, which we already know. And it suggests that maybe you're not using the right mechanism. So with that said, we could potentially do this with a validating webhook, but there's lots of pushback around anything with a validating webhook because it would involve cross-resource validation and be racy. And so then we said, oh, hey, why don't we do this whole provision gateways tracking and gateway class status? And this works to a point, but may not be quite as ideal as we'd like. The concern raised, I think this was from Tim, if I'm remembering conversations correctly, is that there really could be use cases of thousands of gateways trying to use the same gateway class. And should we ever run into that, this pattern does fall apart. I don't know how common they are, but it is certainly a possibility. I tried, a simpler variation of that, which would be using a pattern that we have already for the gateway route relationship. And this would be, kind of a namespaces field with allow and, the same kind of enum here and potential for a selector as an option. That may or may not be simpler, but there's a second part of this that suggests that we could rely on gateway status instead of gateway class status, which, I had initially argued against because it seemed less secure. But I think it was Mike from SIGAUF pointed out that if you are an admin in namespace, you can only grant access to permissions you already have. So as long as you restrict who gets the ability to update gateway status, it could still be relatively secure to take this approach. And that would solve that last problem I talked about which is the limitation in number of gateways that could be stored in a single list in gateway class status. And the last one, because there's been a whole lot of conversation in the community about namespace labels and namespace selectors and how we want to move forward. And so this is the exact same thing as above, but we could use a list instead. The problem with a list is obviously it's more difficult to select a large number of namespaces. So I imagine if we did a list, we would probably also want to support a selector. Anyway, so that's a summary of all the variations of that first approach that is most similar to what we have right now. Any comments or thoughts on this section of approaches? Cool. I'll keep on moving then. Micah, this is one that you're most familiar with.
To note, though,
Oh, go ahead.
yeah, one interesting counterweight to what Antoine was saying is that the stuff that policy is doing. For example, like which namespaces are eligible. So that's just something to just kind of throw in there with that caveat. Like you can write the policy that's just not understandable by anyone else other than the policy agent.
Yeah, yeah, I agree with that. You know, and that's I tried to capture this with saying, you know, this as much as this is as a new concept, it may be one of the easier ones for users to understand. At the same time, it is potentially more work than most of the rest of the implementations than most of the other options for controller implementations. But yeah, this is a simple API that does not require, you know, recreating all the things. But at the same time, I think to go back to something that James said, if we do take an approach like this, we risk being the ones that tried the one thing and then, you know, storage or whoever else does it the right way next time, we have to catch up to them. If this approach doesn't work for storage or whoever else crosses the same pattern next. Yeah, I don't know. And to be, if it's not already clear, I don't have a final answer here. This is more just meant to get some feedback and some thoughts. And this is definitely not something that we'll figure out before RC1. I just, yeah, wanted to write everything out and get some feedback here and some discussion going. So the next one is RBAC. We are all familiar with RBAC. That's the way you do authorization in Kubernetes, right? I think one of the things I've thought about this more as I've been discussing this with others, I came back to this idea of, I think, and I know I've said things contradicting this in the past, but I think what we really want here is a where instead of a who. I'm very open to feedback on this, but I think it feels more natural to describe where a gateway class can be used than who can use a gateway class. That's my idea. I don't have a great list of rationale or reasons why I think that, and I am open to feedback on that. But RBAC, of course, does feel most natural when it is tied to a subject, a user, service account, whatever, than a object like a namespace.
RBAC feels like good for things like maybe automated deployment systems or those sorts of things. So you can say that, oh, your deployment system is able to make gateways with its class, but normally no other users are, maybe.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And so I tried to lay out, this is heavily borrowing from Mike Haya's original proposal here. And you know, this absolutely has the benefit of using our native authorization methods. I described the idea of granting roles to service accounts in namespaces as kind of our way of how you could link this to a namespace. That did not, I don't know, it didn't feel very natural, and the feedback, I can't remember if it was from Mike or Tim, was similar, that it didn't feel quite right. And then the feedback on granting roles directly to subjects, you know, more to the who, you know, it felt like the appropriate use of RBAC, but it didn't feel appropriate for this use case, if that makes sense. And I tried to copy, this is some feedback I got from Mike that I have tried to add here. But just the idea of using RBAC here did not feel like a good idea. Essentially, this does not work well with the Kubernetes authorization model. And although we have used the use verb before, notably in pod security policy, they ended up moving away from it because it was a common point of confusion and frustration. So the feedback I got here from Mike was that although this technically works, it may set us up for more problems down the road, more user confusion, and we already have a example of this being tried and moved away from. So yeah, that was my summary on RBAC. Does anyone have any additional thoughts or feedback on these different approaches here?
So I was a little confused earlier when you were showing 1A, and I guess different ways of implementing 1A, and you mentioned using validating webhook server, and that's the way I figure we would implement the RBAC approach. So the same caveats there would apply here.
I know. It seems to depend on who you're talking to here as far as how much of an issue it is. I know I got some pushback from Jordan when I had explained this potential approach. Just that, anytime you're doing cross-resource validation, you would run into this kind of issue where you have the potential for racy outcomes. But you're completely correct that the same issue seems to apply to RBAC. And I'm not clear what the difference is. But I've had a similar thought. I really should try and clarify that with someone else as well.
I'm curious what those races are. I mean, I can imagine things like you create your RBAC policy and then immediately try to create a gateway, and maybe the admission server hasn't synced the RBAC update yet. And that's always going to be true, right? I mean, that's going to be true for any of these solutions where the gateway class, where you're expressing in some kind of configuration, wherever it is, a restriction based on gateway class or restriction expressing a relationship between gateway class and gateway, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think you're right. I think I need to push back on that and pull in some more people from SIGAUTH just to understand the difference between how this is implemented for something like RBAC or even quota or any other kind of model like this and a webhook. Because it does.
I think it's not so much the race condition, although the race condition does exist. It's that if you in the webhook go and touch other resources, you could conceivably end up in like cycles of webhooks, or just it causes reliability issues.
Right. So if every time you need to create a gateway, you need to do a lookup on gateway class, and that lookup on gateway class is blocked by something else, or is that what you're describing?
Yeah, although, I mean, you could say that's a non-issue, because why would someone do that? But it's like the most reliable webhook is to not have webhook. And the second most reliable webhook is to have a webhook that has no state. And then you like a webhook that relies only on a very specific piece of state, and then it's like looking at multiple resources. So it does introduce more reliability issues. You could say that they are not actual issues in practice.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right that I do need to get a clear answer here and above as far as concerns with using webhooks, because I mean this does seem like a relatively common pattern. Yeah, but yeah, like you're saying, any webhook we use is going to introduce some form of reliability issue or pain in some debugging issue at some point. Okay. Well, I know that we are not through, and we will not get through this today. So I am not going to try and take on the next thing yet. There's a few other things in this doc. I think we may have enough time to follow up in tomorrow's meeting here. In the meantime, if you have time to take a look at this this doc, add any comments or feedback, that would be highly appreciated. There's a lot of different ideas going around. I personally don't see a single front runner right now. But I would love to hear what everyone else thinks. Yeah, with that said, I think we're close to a cut for RC1. I will try and get that out today. If anyone has time in the next, say, 20 minutes, immediately after this meeting, to take one final look at this PR, please do, and we can try and get any adjustments or changes in. Otherwise, I'll plan on pulling this one in and cutting a release candidate. Does that sound reasonable? Cool. All right. We are at time. Thank you, everyone, for the great feedback today, and we will talk to everyone tomorrow.